Hello again. We were talking about how British Sign Language gives information about location. Today we're going to talk about how BSL gives information about time. In fact, the two areas are related. Time and location are related in some ways. BSL makes use of positions in space to get across and to give specific information about time. We're going to be exploring some of the ways that happens today. The first thing to say is that there are both similarities and differences between the way that English gives information about time and the way that BSL gives information about time. Both languages make use of what we might think of as expressions of time. Sometimes in English we call them adverbials of time, because they're telling us when an action happened or took place. So we have things like tomorrow, yesterday, 2 weeks ago, a long time ago. BSL uses expressions of time like that. And often we can get several pieces of information about time in one sentence or one chunk of BSL. The big difference between BSL and English. In English we change the form of the verb so we can show past tense. So in what we call the regular verbs of English, we add ed, and we can say I walked, and we add the ed on the end to show the past tense. In BSL we've found that the form and the verb changes in only relatively few examples. Let's show you some. We have examples like the past tense of win becomes won. The past tense of leave becomes left. The past tense of say becomes said. The past tense of go becomes went. And the past tense of see becomes saw. Now there may be other examples, but we haven't found yet. Even if there are, we know that there are relatively few examples compared with the large number of verbs in the language. So BSL must depend on other means to give the information about time. Before we start explaining this a little bit further, we're going to show you a piece of tape, which again you might find a little bit difficult. Try to see if you can notice how Clark is presenting information about time in this short piece of tape about standing stones. Anyway, we hurried off to Cavendish, and I had to be patient. Remember, I still had a hangover. Anyway, we arrived at Cavendish, and I got out and looked, and I said, what's this about? There was nothing there, just standing stones. Standing stones. Stones, what are they about? There they were. So I looked, and then I wondered about it, and I read a plaque that was going to explain what it was about. So I read it, and I pondered over it, and it said it was over 4,000 years old. Over 4,000 years old. really old. And then it said it's best if you view it as if you were a bird. That's right, okay, so then I looked and I realized what it was about. It was in the shape of a cross. Ah, the standing stones were just like a cross. Then I realized that must have been what it was about that long time ago. So the deaf were talking. The cross, that's related to Jesus, something related to Jesus. So that's right, it's Jesus. So I was just walking away and I said, no, that's impossible. 4,000 years ago, Jesus wasn't there 4,000 years ago. He was there 2,000 years ago. How was it 4,000 years ago? A cross, how? It meant the cross came before Jesus. I couldn't think of it. I'd always related a cross to Jesus. But no, it was before that. So I was amazed. And I kept asking people, but then a social worker who was with us as an interpreter said, it really belongs to the Druids. Ah, the Druids. Oh, I understand. Yes, I've heard about the Celts emigrating into Scotland. That's right. It's the same as Stonehenge and the stones there. It's related to the ones at Cavendish. But I was suspicious. No, I think it's related to space. Maybe an alien in the past had landed. Who knows? So, well, Clark surely seems to have visited some fascinating places. I wonder if you managed to get all of the information he was presenting, particularly the information about time. You'll probably notice that in this piece he's actually referring mainly to past time. Now if you look at how I've just signed that, I made the sign related to past over my right shoulder. And in fact we think that in BSL there's something that we call a timeline running across the right shoulder. And when we make signs moving forward in front of the shoulder, that relates to the future. And when we make signs going back over the shoulder, they normally relate to the past. And we'll be looking at some examples in Clark's extract. You might also have seen that he uses his left arm as a base to show time. And again he takes a central point around the wrist. And everything behind from that point relates to past. And normally everything in front of that, going forward, relates to the future. If we look at some specific examples, for example, when Clark is talking about 4,000 years ago, he actually uses the sign that I've just used, 4,000 years ago, and it shows it was a long time ago. But then he also uses two pointing signs. The first one with the thumb, and he points back over the shoulder. And the second one is the finger pointing back over the shoulder. But then, if he wants to show before or a long time ago, he can use his arm. He can show a long time ago in this way. You'll notice that he uses two different signs that both can be translated into English words. Before. The first is before, and the second is before. Now that second sign is particularly frequently used when we want to show one thing happened before something else. So in this case, we're talking about before Christ lived. So you'll see that sign, again, occurring quite a lot in the extracts. Sometimes it's done with two hands. The arm is also used for a number of signs when we want to emphasize it was a long time ago. And we use facial expression and the change in the intensity of the sign. I wonder if you saw when Clark was talking about Stonehenge. He placed Stonehenge and the information in front of his body just to the right, and when he wanted to show that Stonehenge was linked back in time a long way, he took it back. He took the sign right back and related on the left shoulder to Cavendish. And then again that's using this timeline. It seems to us in BSL there are 4 timelines. The 2 that we've shown and 2 more. That sounds very complicated information about time. But I think that when you've watched the examples you'll find it very easy. Let's look at first the diagram, a graphic of 4 timelines. And then we'll start and give you some examples from timeline A. Probably timeline A is already familiar to you, because most people tend to learn ways of showing past fairly early on when they're learning to sign. If you watch